The third time Victoria Hale held out her hand, I still didn't give her the keys. "Mr. Reyes," she said, "the bill has been paid." She spoke quickly, but she never raised her voice. Her phone was in her right hand, lighting up with one call after another from her board. Her left hand stayed open in front of me, waiting for the keys to the dark gray SUV. Her 10-year-old daughter, Lily, was already in the passenger seat, looking down as she fastened her seat belt. I closed my fist around the keys. "This car can't leave yet." Victoria stopped looking at me and turned to my boss, Marty Collins. Marty stepped between us and flipped the paid invoice around so I could see it. The scan came back clean. The road test was clean. She brought it in for a routine inspection. "Daniel, give her the keys." Everything he said was true. There were no warning lights on the dash. The computer had stored no brake faults. The SUV had behaved normally on a low-speed road test that morning. With almost any other car in the shop, I would have signed the release and moved on. But when I drove that SUV from my bay to the parking lot, the brake pedal came back under my foot a fraction too slowly. Just once. The second time I pressed it, it felt normal again. I got out and walked around to the left front wheel. On the inside of the tire, I saw one fresh drop of clear fluid. It wasn't a puddle or even a trail. It left a wet spot on the concrete about the size of a quarter. I put the SUV back on the lift and spent more than 10 minutes looking at the flexible brake hose under a work light. There were 2 shallow pinch marks on the outer surface, with a cut between them no wider than a strand of hair. Road debris rarely hits that spot cleanly enough to leave a mark like that. Long-term rubbing doesn't leave 2 matching impressions on opposite sides either. But the cut was closed. I couldn't stand in the parking lot and prove it would open. I couldn't say who had touched it. But Lily was already in the car. "Can you give me a written diagnosis?" Victoria asked. "Not yet." "Do you have a test result?" "Nothing from the computer." "Then what exactly are you using to hold my car?" The pedal returned slowly once. "There's fresh brake fluid by the left front wheel, and the hose has damage that shouldn't be there." Marty bent down and looked at the concrete. Dust around the tire had already soaked up most of the drop. "One drop," he said. "You could have gotten that on the floor while you were inspecting it." Victoria's phone rang again. She declined the call, and this time she didn't bother hiding her impatience. "I have a meeting at 10 that cannot be moved. Your employer has cleared the vehicle for release. If you recommend more testing, put it in the report and I'll deal with it later." "You might not get a later." She stared at me. I heard how that sounded and corrected myself. "I mean, I can't explain why it's only leaking this much. But I'm not going to watch you put your daughter in this car and take it onto the highway." Lily was watching us through the windshield. Her seatbelt was buckled, and her backpack rested by her feet. Marty pulled me aside and lowered his voice. "Her company sends more than 40 vehicles here. You wanted extra time to check this one, and I gave it to you. Now hand over the keys. I haven't done a heat cycle pressure test. Because this isn't a race shop. We can't hold a vehicle until this afternoon when every standard check says it's fine. Those marks on the hose aren't normal wear. Can you prove that?" I didn't answer. He asked again. "Can you prove it?" "Not yet." Marty nodded as if that was the answer he'd been waiting for. I went back to the service counter and wrote "Do not release" across the paperwork order. I signed my name and sketched the location of the damaged hose beside it. Then I entered the same safety warning in the shop's computer system. Marty stood at another terminal and watched me save it. Less than a minute later, the warning disappeared from my screen. "Did you delete that?" I asked. As the owner of the shop, I corrected an unsupported personal opinion. "Put it back. Give the customer her keys." Victoria was already on the phone. First, she called her attorney. Then she called the police. She didn't claim I'd threatened her or make anything up. She simply said the bill had been paid, the shop had authorized release, and one employee was refusing to return her property. When the officers arrived, Marty told them the vehicle was cleared to go. Victoria showed them proof of payment. When it was my turn, all I had was a handwritten warning and one drop of brake fluid that was almost dry. The older officer asked, "Are the keys on you?" "Yes." "Has the owner of the shop told you to return them?" "Yes." "And you've refused?" "Yes." He told me they weren't there to evaluate a brake hose. They couldn't hold a customer's vehicle because of one mechanic's suspicion. I needed to return the keys and put whatever concerns I had in writing. There was an easy way out of that moment. I could have handed over the keys, taken off my gloves, and told myself I'd done my job. If something happened later, my name was on the paper copy. At least I would have warned them. My hand was already in my pocket, touching the keys. Then Lily opened the passenger door to pick up a water bottle she'd dropped outside. She climbed back in and pulled the seat belt across her chest. Victoria stood by the driver's door, thanking the officer. From our parking lot, the highway entrance was only a few minutes away. I turned, walked to the front of the SUV, and opened the hood. "Daniel," Marty called behind me. I kept moving. The fuse box on that model sits on the right side of the engine bay. I opened the cover, pulled the starter relay, and slipped it into my tool pouch. It took less than 10 seconds. The younger officer grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the vehicle. "What did you take?" "The starter relay. The car won't start without it." "Give it to me. Put the car on a tow truck and I will." Marty glanced toward the waiting area, checking how many people were watching. "You're fired." He said it loudly enough for every mechanic and every customer in the room to hear. "You hear me? You're fired. Now give the customer back her property." I didn't move. The older officer reached into the pocket of my work shirt, took the keys, and handed them to Victoria. When the cuffs closed, the right one caught the edge of my sleeve. As the officer pulled me back, Marty ripped the white Daniel patch from my chest. It hit the floor and someone stepped on it. Victoria had the keys and was standing beside the open driver's door. Some of the anger had left her face, but Lily was still in the passenger seat. I pointed at the left front wheel. "Don't drive." The officer kept pulling me away. "Get the child out. Tow the car." No one suddenly believed me because I shouted it. The person who finally stopped that SUV from leaving was Victoria's insurance advisor. Her attorney was still on the phone dealing with the fact that I'd removed a component. But the insurance advisor heard that brake fluid had been found and that a written brake warning had existed. The insurer immediately refused to approve the car being driven away. No one said I was right. The insurance company simply wouldn't put its name behind that vehicle going back on the road. The advisor ordered a flatbed tow and told Victoria the SUV had to go to an independent test facility. Victoria offered to sign a liability waiver. The advisor told her a waiver wouldn't make a reported brake hazard disappear. She stood in the parking lot for a few seconds, then opened the passenger door. "Lily, get out." From the back of the police car, I watched Lily walk over to her mother with her backpack in both arms. I didn't hand over the starter relay until the tow operator had secured the SUV's front wheels. That didn't make the cuffs come off. The police took me in for a statement. They documented that I'd withheld the keys, removed a vehicle component without authorization, and refused an officer's direction at the scene. A few hours later, I was given a notice to appear and released. My toolbox was still at the shop. My name was already gone from the schedule. The next morning, an insurance investigator called and asked if I'd come to the independent facility to identify what I'd seen. "I don't touch the vehicle, right?" I asked. "Correct. You observe and answer questions." "That's enough." By the time I arrived, the SUV had been strapped to a roller test rig. For heavy restraints held the body in place. A test driver sat behind the wheel and separate equipment monitored the brake pressure. Victoria stood behind the glass in the observation room. Lily wasn't there. She'd been left with her grandmother. Marty had come too. He carried the shop's service records and kept reminding the investigator that our computer scan and low-speed road test had both been normal. I didn't argue with him about that. They had been normal. The driver started with the wheels turning slowly and applied the brakes several times. Pressure stayed steady. No fresh fluid appeared by the left front wheel. Marty looked at me through the glass. He didn't have to say "I told you so." The speed increased. The driver ran the first series of braking cycles, building heat in the system. The pressure line moved slightly, then recovered. The independent technician came out of the control room. "We can't confirm a failure at this point," he said. Victoria asked, "So everything yesterday could have been over one drop on the floor?" "It could have been." The test isn't finished. He turned to me. What did the pedal feel like? It didn't go soft. It came back slowly, like something held the pressure for a second and then sealed again. What conditions do you think we need? Get the hose hot and keep applying pressure. Don't stop after one brake application. He didn't follow my suggestion just because I sounded certain. He checked the equipment limits, confirmed the procedure with the insurance investigator, and returned to the control room. The second run began. The rollers grew louder. The speed passed 50 miles an hour and the pressure still looked normal. Marty folded his arms. Victoria's phone started vibrating again. This time, she didn't look at it. At 60 miles per hour, the driver pressed the brake pedal. The pressure line dropped. Then it came back. Marty had just started to say, sensor fluctuation, when the line fell straight to zero. A thin stream of brake fluid sprayed from the inside of the left front wheel and hit the safety shield. The rollers were still spinning at highway speed. The wheel wasn't slowing the way the test required. An alarm sounded in the control room. The driver cut power to the SUV, and the rig's emergency system took over the rollers. Within seconds, the speed display reached zero. All 4 restraints held. The SUV didn't go anywhere. No one in the observation room spoke. The independent technician pressed the intercom and locked down the test area. No one touches the vehicle. Save the pressure data. Preserve the fluid on the floor. Do not remove any components. Victoria stepped closer to the glass. She looked at the driver's seat, then at the empty passenger seat. She was sitting there yesterday, she said. No one had to ask who she meant. I looked at Marty. Before the test, he'd used the normal low-speed results to show that I was wasting everyone's time. Now the independent technician placed the report in front of him and told him to sign beside the words complete loss of brake pressure. Marty held the pen over the page. That's why I didn't give her the keys, I said. He signed. The red marks from the cuffs were still on my wrists, and my name was still gone from the schedule. Marty recovered before anyone else. He took me into the hallway and offered to reverse the firing, pay me for the previous day, double my diagnostic bonus, and put me back in charge of Victoria's company fleet. You were right, he said. I admit it. We'll replace the hose and give her a full brake inspection. You can pick up a clean uniform this afternoon. What goes in the final report? Sudden hose deterioration. What happens to the old hose? Normal scrap. And the warning I entered? He didn't answer. My rent was due in 5 days. If I agreed, I could be earning money again that afternoon. I could even go back as the mechanic who'd saved a CEO. Marty saw me hesitate and lowered his voice. 11 people work at that shop. If you turn this into deliberate sabotage, our insurer could drop us. Customers will leave. Don't destroy 11 families just to prove you're smarter than everyone else. I don't need to prove I'm smarter. I looked through the window at the SUV. I need that hose preserved. Marks on an old hose don't mean someone tried to kill her. Then let the independent technician examine it before anyone decides what it means. Marty folded the reinstatement papers. Walk out of this hall and yesterday's firing stands. Then don't get a uniform ready for me. I went back into the test area and asked the independent technician to put the SUV on a lift. He didn't remove the hose right away. First, he pulled a naturally aged hose of the same type from the facility's scrap rack and placed both under a light. The old hose had a faded, chalky surface. Its worn area was broad, with small cracks around the edges. The damage on the SUV was a narrow opening with fresh edges and 2 opposing pressure marks. Road debris didn't make marks like that. It looked as if someone had pinched the hose with a narrow tool, then cut into it while holding the opening closed. I explained what I could see. I didn't claim to know who had done it or call it attempted murder. This isn't age, I said. Someone kept the cut narrow. You wouldn't see it at low speed. It opens when the pressure builds. The technician studied it through a magnifier, then told his staff to set up a camera. Record the entire removal. Bag the hose separately. Marty watched from outside the glass. I handed the investigator the paperwork order I'd kept folded in my wallet. It had the time, my signature, the location of the hose, and the words "do not release." The investigator asked if I understood that the same paper also showed I'd withheld the keys and removed the starter relay after Marty had canceled my hold. I understand. You're sure you want this entered into the record? I'm sure. Marty heard me from the doorway. Then you won't be coming back to my shop. My attorney can deal with the customer record you took and the component you removed. He didn't raise his voice this time. He put the reinstatement papers away and left. The hose had just been sealed inside a clear evidence bag when 3 people came through the front doors. The man in front wore a dark gray suit with no tie. An identification badge from Victoria's company hung from his jacket. He looked at the SUV, then at the bag, and finally at me. Which one of you is Daniel Reyes? I am. Gavin Ross, head of corporate security. He didn't offer his hand. Effective immediately, the vehicle and every component removed from it are under the control of our security department. An attorney behind him handed a document to the facility manager. The vehicle belonged to a company executive, he said. The test records involved confidential corporate information. Anyone keeping or copying them without authorization could face legal action. Victoria walked over. Gavin will handle the security side from here, she said. I pointed toward the SUV, still sitting on the test rig. Marty said he'd handle it yesterday. Gavin reached for the evidence bag. I stepped in front of the table without touching him. Don't touch that hose. He glanced at the red marks on my wrists. You were taken away by the police yesterday for interfering with company property. Are you trying to do this again? The relay could be put back. If that hose gets washed or cut open, it can never be put back the way it was. You don't get to decide what counts as evidence. Then let an independent agency decide. Not you. His fingers touched the edge of the bag. Victoria spoke before he could lift it. No one touches it. Gavin turned toward her. Victoria, the company needs to control the information. My daughter was in that car yesterday. The hose stays here. She looked at the independent technician. Don't release it to my company or to the repair shop. Follow the formal evidence procedure. Gavin's attorney asked why I was so certain the damage was deliberate. I pointed to the enlarged image of the hose. The pinch marks didn't drag. The car was probably sitting still when this was done. The tool had narrow jaws. As for when it happened, I need the intake photos from Marty's shop. Gavin pushed the photograph back across the table. A fired mechanic can tell all of that from one old hose? I don't know who touched it, I said. I only know they didn't want it to fail at low speed. Victoria looked up from the hose. The investigator asked who knew she would be taking the highway that morning. That was when she told us the board meeting hadn't been routine. Her company manufactured medical devices. An internal audit had found purchase orders being split into smaller contracts and routed to vendors connected to the chief operating officer. Victoria had planned to present the evidence that morning and ask the board to suspend him. Very few people knew she would drop Lily off first and then take that SUV on the highway to headquarters. Gavin stood nearby without saying anything. Why didn't you tell us this yesterday? The investigator asked. Victoria looked at me. I thought it was a dispute over a repair bill, she said. I didn't think the meeting had anything to do with the car. Yesterday, I just needed you to get your daughter out, I said. Gavin's attorney filed a complaint with the State Automotive Repair Board that same day. They accused me of unlawfully withholding a vehicle, removing a component without permission, and taking a customer work order. They also suggested I might have damaged the hose myself to prove I'd been right. Marty joined them because he was trying to save his shop. He claimed the SUV had been in perfect condition when it arrived and that the brake fluid appeared only after I took over the job. I asked him, where are the intake photos? He didn't answer. Our shop photographed all 4 wheels whenever a vehicle came in. It kept customers from blaming us for old scratches when they picked up their cars. There was no chance the service desk had skipped that step on Victoria's SUV. You photographed this one too, I said. The left front wheel will be in the intake record. The insurance investigator formally requested the original images. Marty argued that the photos were for cosmetic disputes and had nothing to do with the brakes. The investigator told him to turn them over anyway. When the left front image went up on the screen, its timestamp was 37 minutes before I'd first touched the SUV. There were no fresh scratches on the wheel. But when the inside of the wheel was enlarged, a small wet spot was visible directly below the brake hose. The facility manager placed that picture beside a photograph of the drop we'd found in the parking lot. Marty asked him to zoom back out. The manager ignored him. Gavin's attorney insisted that one drop of fluid didn't prove the cut already existed. "You're right," I said. "That's why we preserved the hose for a pressure test instead of throwing it in the scrap bin." The shop's computer records later showed that my safety warning had been deleted from Marty's administrator account 47 seconds after I entered it. The parking lot camera had also been shut off manually during the same period. Marty finally admitted he deleted the warning and disabled the camera because he didn't want a record of himself forcing a VIP vehicle out over a mechanic's objection. He continued to deny touching the hose, and the intake photograph supported him on that point. I asked him, "You saw the warning I wrote, didn't you?" Marty didn't answer. "And you deleted it anyway." That exchange became part of the hearing record. The hearing was set for 2 months later. Until then, I had no steady income. The clip spreading online was still the same 19 seconds from the parking lot. It showed the police holding me while Marty shouted, "You're fired," and I refused to return the customer's car. Almost no one saw the full test footage. I interviewed at 2 repair shops. The first owner recognized me and asked if I would pull a customer's starter relay every time I disagreed with him. The second was more polite. He said he didn't want to get pulled into a lawsuit. I sold some of my tools to cover the rent. Victoria offered to let her company's attorneys handle the hearing. I accepted payment for my legal expenses, but I wouldn't let her company decide what I was going to say. "Why?" she asked. "Because the first time someone said they'd handle it for you, you almost drove that car away." On the day of the hearing, Gavin sat between company attorneys. Marty sat on the other side of the room. The papers filed by both sides called me an emotionally unstable former employee. Gavin's attorney froze the parking lot video on the moment I opened the SUV's hood. "Mr. Reyes, do you admit that you removed a component from the vehicle without the owner's permission?" "Yes." "Do you admit that you kept the keys after the owner of the shop ordered you to release them?" "Yes." "At the time, did you have a laboratory report proving the hose had been deliberately damaged?" "No." "You couldn't even prove that the brakes would fail, could you?" "Not then." "So everything you did was based on a feeling." I placed the paperwork order on the table. It wasn't just a feeling. The pedal returned slowly. There was brake fluid on the ground, and the hose had a fresh cut. I couldn't prove who had touched that car. I had one choice: let the police take me away, or let that child ride onto the highway in it. The attorney didn't ask another question about Lily. The independent technician rolled a clear protective case to the front of the room. Inside were 2 brake hoses of the same type. One had aged naturally. The other had been given a narrow cut and matching pinch marks based on the damaged hose from the SUV. Gauges outside the case displayed pressure and temperature. Gavin's attorney asked if I wanted to say anything before the demonstration began. "The naturally worn hose will start seeping through the worn area," I said. "The other one won't do anything while it's cold. Once the temperature comes up, it'll open beside the lower pinch mark. Pressure will drop, recover once, then fall to 0. The technician started the test. At low temperature, both hoses held. As the system heated up, the naturally aged hose began to seep slowly. A thin line appeared near the lower pinch mark on the other one. The pressure gauge dropped, then recovered. Gavin's attorney glanced up at it and went back to his papers. Seconds later, the cut opened fully. The pressure needle fell to 0. The independent technician shut down the equipment. He confirmed that the sequence matched the SUV's failure at 60 miles per hour. Without the heat cycle and repeated brake applications I'd requested, a routine computer scan and low-speed test would have cleared the vehicle. Next came the paperwork order I'd written before the confrontation, followed by the shop's intake photograph. The fluid was already visible in that photograph before I'd touched the car. Then the company garage records were presented. The SUV had spent the night before the repair visit in Victoria's underground company garage. A backup camera showed Gavin approaching the left front wheel with a tool bag, even though he had no maintenance assignment. A narrow jaw clamping tool was missing from the company's tool room. More important, Victoria had originally been assigned a backup vehicle. That morning, Gavin had canceled it and directed her to use the SUV. The company's audit team also recovered messages between Gavin and the chief operating officer about changing Victoria's vehicle assignment and delaying the board materials. No camera showed a blade cutting the hose. But Gavin had access to the SUV, had taken a tool that fit the marks, knew Victoria's highway route, and had personally made sure she used that vehicle. The hearing officer looked at Gavin. You described Mr. Reyes as a man creating panic based on a feeling. His predicted failure conditions, the timing of the damage, and the method used are now supported by independent evidence. Gavin stopped looking at me. He spoke quietly to his attorney and remained in his seat. Police obtained an arrest warrant that afternoon. Gavin was arrested for vehicle tampering and attempted murder. The chief operating officer who'd helped him was suspended by the board, and the procurement kickback case was referred for criminal investigation. The State Automotive Repair Board found that Marty had deleted a safety warning, shut off a camera, ordered the release of a dangerous vehicle, and later tried to have the hose discarded as ordinary scrap. His license to operate the shop was revoked. Before the hearing ended, Marty's attorney asked whether I would return to run the diagnostic department if the shop changed ownership. I pushed the reinstatement papers back across the table. I said the car couldn't be released, and you deleted the record. After the test, I said the hose couldn't be thrown away, and you tried to throw it away. What would I be going back to? I didn't return. The repair board's written decision gave its own paragraph to the 47 seconds between my warning and Marty's deletion. 3 weeks later, the shop closed. Victoria withdrew every complaint against me and covered my legal bills and 6 weeks of lost income. She didn't send an assistant with a check and call it finished. At a company-wide meeting, she put the parking lot video on the screen. When it reached the frame of me in handcuffs, she told her employees that she had used her attorneys, her position, and her connections to make the police treat a mechanic like an obstacle. I pushed them to deal with Daniel because I thought my time mattered more, she said. But even after they put him in cuffs, he was still yelling at me to get my daughter out of the car. Later, she offered me a job as the company's director of vehicle safety. The salary was far beyond what I'd made at the repair shop. It came with an office, bonuses, and full benefits. I turned it down. You don't trust my company? She asked. You have attorneys and a fleet of 40 vehicles. Ordinary drivers have none of that. I want to do this kind of testing for them. I gave her a different proposal. Plenty of repair shops can replace a worn part. Very few can afford to spend hours chasing a failure that appears once and leaves nothing on a computer scan. The equipment is expensive, and the time is difficult to charge to a customer. A lot of drivers end up taking their keys back with the same answer: everything looks normal right now. I wanted to build an independent brake and vehicle safety diagnostic center for those cases. Her company could pay for the initial equipment, but it wouldn't own the test results. It couldn't choose which vehicles we accepted, and its executives wouldn't get a priority line. An independent road safety organization would oversee the center, and the funding and testing rules would be public. Victoria read the proposal and asked, "That includes me?" "Especially you." The center opened a few months later. One Wednesday during our first week, I saw the same dark gray SUV pull into the lot. Its entire braking system had been replaced, including the left front hose. Victoria didn't call me from the parking lot. She walked to the number dispenser, took a ticket, and sat down beside an older man who had arrived in a battered pickup. Lily came over to the test counter with her backpack in her arms. "This belongs to you," she said. She handed me a white name patch. It was the same patch Marty had torn from my work shirt. By the time the police returned it with the other evidence, the edges had started to fray, and there was a scratch across the word Daniel. I turned it over. On the back, in Lily's uneven handwriting, was one sentence. He stopped the car before anyone believed him. "My mom checked the spelling," she said. "I can tell. Aren't you going to wear it?" I looked down at my new work shirt. It didn't have a name patch, only the center's logo. "No," I said. "But I'm keeping it." I opened the clear drawer beneath the test counter and placed the old patch inside. Beside it was the first brake safety report our new center had completed. The number display lit up in the waiting area. It wasn't Victoria's number. I closed the drawer and walked to the door. "Number 42, I called. "Who's got 42? The man with the battered pickup raised his hand. I took his keys and led him toward the first test bay.